Look at this photograph. Take your time with it. It's from the early 20th century, somewhere between 1900 and 1920, based on the clothing, the photographic quality, and the interior details. We're inside what appears to be a tenement apartment, the kind that housed hundreds of thousands of immigrant families in American cities during this period. The room is small, cramped. The ceiling is sagging. You can see fabric or material draped across it, either covering damage or trying to insulate the space. The walls are bare wood, rough planks, no plaster, or if there was plaster, it's long gone. To the left, there's a large stove, a coal or wood-burning stove with a prominent chimney pipe running up toward the ceiling. Hanging on the wall beside it, a few pieces of clothing, a towel maybe, some pots or pans. In the center of the frame, standing close together, are 3 children. A boy on the left, looking directly at the camera, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He's wearing light-colored clothing, a shirt, simple pants. Next to him, a slightly older child, also looking at the camera, but with a different expression, more reserved, darker clothing. And to the right, a younger child, smaller, also facing the camera. Behind them, partially visible in the doorway, is an adult, a man. He's watching, but he's not the focus. He's in the background, literally and compositionally. This is not a family portrait. This is not a moment of celebration. This is a photograph taken of these people, not for them. And that distinction matters more than you might think.
But before we go any further, let me be very clear about what I can and cannot tell you about this image. I can tell you what's visible. I cannot tell you who these people are. I can tell you when this style of photography was common. I cannot tell you the exact date this was taken. I can tell you what kind of building this likely was. I cannot tell you the address. This photograph exists in archives. It was preserved, digitized, made accessible. But the people in it? They were not preserved in the same way. And that's not an accident. Let me describe what we're seeing in more detail. The stove dominates the left side of the frame. It's massive, the kind of cast iron heating and cooking stove that would have been essential in a tenement apartment. No central heating, no gas lines in many of these buildings. This stove would have been everything: heat source, cooking surface, water heater. The chimney pipe is makeshift. You can see how it's been assembled, probably by the residents themselves, running up through the ceiling. That sagging ceiling is important. It's not decorative. That's either a tarp or heavy fabric stretched across to catch falling plaster or to keep heat from escaping, or both. Tenement ceilings failed constantly. Landlords didn't repair them, residents improvised. On the walls, minimal possessions, a few items hanging, practical things, nothing decorative. There's a doorway in the back. You can see through to another space, though it's unclear if that's another room or a hallway. The light in the photograph is artificial, probably flash powder, which was the standard for indoor photography in this era. That tells us something. This photograph was planned. Someone came here with equipment, with intention. This wasn't a casual image. Now, the children. They're standing very close together, not quite touching, but clearly positioned as a group. The boy on the left is the most directly engaged with the camera. His posture is straight. He's looking right at the lens. But his expression isn't what you might expect. He doesn't look distressed. He doesn't look particularly sad. He looks aware, present, maybe a little curious about what's happening. The child in the middle is more reserved, standing slightly back. The expression is harder to read, more guarded maybe. The smallest child on the right seems less certain about what's happening, younger, less accustomed to this kind of attention. And in the back, the man. He's watching the scene, but he's not part of it, not really. He's there, but he's not centered, not named, not the subject. This photograph is about the space these people occupy, not the people themselves.
And to understand what you're looking at, you need to understand what photography meant in the early 20th century. Photography was expensive, deliberate, purpose-driven. When someone came into a tenement apartment with a camera, it wasn't to create a family keepsake. It was to create evidence. Starting in the 1880s, social reformers in American cities began using photography as a tool. The most famous of these reformers was Jacob Riis. Riis was a journalist and photographer who documented tenement conditions in New York City. His book, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, was filled with photographs of immigrant families living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The book was shocking, influential. It helped lead to housing reforms. But here's what's important to understand about Riis and the reformers who followed him. They weren't photographers in the artistic sense. They were documentarians, activists, people who believed that showing poverty would compel action. Their photographs weren't meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be persuasive. After Riis, others followed. Lewis Hine documented child labor, children working in factories, coal mines, cotton mills. The Tenement House Committee hired photographers to document building violations. Charity organizations photographed worthy families to justify funding. Municipal housing inspectors photographed structural failures to pressure landlords. All of this photography had a purpose. It was used in reports, legislative hearings, fundraising campaigns, newspaper exposés, and it worked. Laws changed, building codes were passed, child labor restrictions were implemented. Photography helped make invisible suffering visible. But, and this is crucial, the photographs were never for the people being photographed. They were created about them, to argue on behalf of them, but not with them. Here's how it worked. A reformer, maybe a housing inspector, maybe a charity worker, maybe a journalist, would visit a tenement building. They'd identify families living in the worst conditions. They'd arrange to photograph them. Sometimes they'd ask permission, sometimes they wouldn't. The photograph would be taken. Then it would be filed, cataloged, labeled, not with names, with categories. Typical tenement interior, family of 5 in one room, effects of overcrowding. The image would appear in a report. The report would circulate. Legislators would see it. The public would see it. And sometimes, eventually, conditions would improve. New laws, inspections, pressure on landlords. But the family in the photograph, no one went back to tell them what their image had been used for. No one recorded what happened to them afterward. The photograph served its purpose. The people in it were no longer relevant.
But let me tell you how extensive this documentation was. By the early 1900s, reform organizations in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston had cataloged thousands of tenement photographs. The Tenement House Department in New York alone had entire filing systems. Buildings were tracked by address. Violations were numbered and categorized. Each photograph was labeled with the type of violation it depicted: inadequate ventilation, insufficient light, structural damage, overcrowding. They knew exactly how many families lived in each building, how many rooms per family, how many people per room, whether there was running water, indoor plumbing, fire escapes. The documentation was meticulous. Every structural detail was recorded. But the people? The families living in those conditions? Their names almost never appear in the archives. Here's an example of how this worked. A photograph would be taken of a family in a one-room apartment. The photograph would be filed with this kind of label: address, 98 Orchard Street. Date, 1908. Violation, family of 6 occupying single room, 10 by 12 feet, no windows, inadequate ventilation. The image would be used in a report arguing for better housing standards. The report would cite statistics. In this district, 67% of families live in similar conditions. Legislators would see the photograph. The public would see it. Outrage would build. Laws would pass. But if you tried to find out what happened to the family at 98 Orchard Street, you'd hit a wall. No names in the housing department files, no cross-reference to census records, no follow-up documentation. The system tracked buildings. It didn't track people. And this wasn't an oversight.
This was by design. Reformers genuinely believed, that focusing on individual stories was inefficient. If you told the story of one family, people might feel sympathy for that specific family. They might donate to help that specific family. But that wouldn't change the system. What reformers wanted was structural change, new building codes, mandatory inspections, legal consequences for landlords who violated standards. And to get that, they needed to show that the problem was widespread, not tragic individual cases, but systemic failure. So they deliberately depersonalized their documentation. Families became examples, children became evidence. Individual identities were considered distracting from the larger point. Now let's talk about this specific photograph. This image exists in multiple archives. It appears in at least 2 separate reform publications from the early 1900s. Each time it appears, it's captioned slightly differently. One publication labels it Typical Tenement Living Conditions, Immigrant Family. Another, Interior Showing Effects of Landlord Neglect. The room is described in detail: the sagging ceiling, the makeshift stove installation, the cramped quarters. But the children? No names, no ages, no family name. No indication of what neighborhood this was, what building, what year exactly. You can see them clearly in the photograph, but you cannot trace them. And here's what makes this particularly strange. The photograph was circulated widely enough that it appeared in multiple publications. That means someone thought it was important, representative, worth preserving, but not important enough to name who it depicted. Think about that for a moment. Important enough to photograph, important enough to publish, important enough to use as evidence in arguments for legal reform, but not important enough to name. I've tried to trace this image. I've looked through tenement house reports from New York, Boston, and Chicago between 1900 and 2010. I've cross-referenced the visual details, the style of stove, the construction of the walls, the type of ceiling damage. And what I've found is this. I can trace the arguments this photograph was used to make. I can trace the legislation that images like this helped pass. I can even trace some of the buildings that were inspected and improved as a result of this kind of documentation. But I cannot trace these specific children. They exist in the photograph. They do not exist in the historical record that surrounds it.
Let me explain how this happened, not just in this case, but systematically. Because this isn't a unique situation. This is how reform photography worked. When these photographs were taken, there were several systems that could have preserved people's identities: census records, immigration records, school enrollment, church registries, employment logs. But here's the problem. The photographs weren't connected to those systems. Reform photographers didn't coordinate with census takers. They didn't cross-reference immigration documentation. They didn't follow up with schools or churches. They operated in their own separate documentary universe. They photographed people, they filed the images institutionally, and then they moved on. And the people being photographed? They often had very good reasons not to appear in official records. If you were an undocumented immigrant, you avoided institutions. If you were working illegally, maybe child labor, maybe unlicensed work, you didn't want your name attached to documentation. If you were living in an apartment with more people than the lease allowed, you didn't want the landlord to know everyone who was there. If you were trying to avoid truant officers because your children were working instead of attending school, you kept a low profile. So when a photographer showed up and said they were documenting housing conditions, not people, there was no reason to give your name. And the photographer? They didn't ask. They didn't need it. They needed the image, not the identity. Here's what this meant in practice. A family could be photographed. Their image could be published. It could appear in newspapers, in legislative reports, in fundraising materials. Thousands of people might see their faces. And yet, no official record would connect those faces to names. No paper trail would follow them forward in time. They could be everywhere in the visual archive and nowhere in the documentary record.
Let me tell you what we can trace about this image. We know it was used in reform publications. We know it was categorized as evidence of poor housing conditions. And we know what arguments were being made with images like this in the early 1900s. Reformers were pushing for several specific legislative changes. The Tenement House Act of 1901 in New York had established new standards, but enforcement was weak. Reformers wanted mandatory inspections. They wanted building codes that required windows in every room, fire escapes, indoor plumbing, minimum square footage per occupant. And they wanted legal consequences for landlords who didn't maintain their properties. And they used photographs like this to make their case. So here's how it worked. A legislator who had never been inside a tenement apartment would see this photograph. They'd see the sagging ceiling, the cramped space, the children standing in those conditions. And they'd be moved, either by genuine concern or by political pressure, to support reform legislation. Reformers would present these images alongside statistics. 67% of tenement apartments lack adequate ventilation. Families of 6 or more routinely occupy single rooms. Child mortality rates in these buildings are 3 times higher than in other neighborhoods. The photographs provided visual proof. The statistics provided scale. Together, they made a compelling argument. And it worked. Between 1900 and 2010, significant housing reforms passed in major American cities. Building codes were strengthened. Inspection systems were established. Some of the worst tenement buildings were condemned. New construction had to meet higher standards. Thousands of families benefited from these changes. Living conditions improved, slowly, unevenly, but measurably. And photographs like this one played a role in making that happen. So, in that sense, this image mattered. It contributed to real, tangible change. But here's the question I keep coming back to. What happened to these specific children? Did their building get inspected? Did their landlord face consequences? Did their living conditions improve? Or were they just used as evidence and then forgotten?
Now that you know how this photograph was used, look at it again. Look at the children's faces. Really look at them. The boy on the left, the one looking directly at the camera, his expression isn't what you'd expect if this were a photograph about suffering. He's not performing distress. He's not looking down or away. He's looking at the camera with something that reads almost like curiosity, like he's wondering what this machine is, what this person is doing in his home. There's an alertness there, a presence. This is a child who exists fully in this moment, not as a symbol, but as a person. The child in the middle has a different energy, more guarded, more reserved, maybe older, maybe more aware of what's happening. The expression is harder to read, but there's a seriousness there. This isn't someone who's comfortable being looked at this way. And the youngest child, there's an uncertainty, a wariness. This might be the first time they've seen a camera, or maybe they've learned that when strangers come with equipment, it's not usually good news. The man in the background, he's barely visible, but he's there, watching. Not the focus of the frame, but aware of it. Is he the father, an uncle, an older brother? We don't know. We just know he's present for this moment, and then erased from the record. Here's what strikes me about this photograph now. These children aren't performing poverty. They're not collapsed in despair. They're not reaching out for help. They're just standing there, existing in their space. And the photographer came in and said, "This is what I need you to be evidence of." Not, "Tell me your story," not, "What do you need?" Just stand there. I need to show people how you live. And the children complied, because what choice did they have? An adult came into their home with a camera. In that era, in that power dynamic, you didn't say no. So they stood. They faced the camera, the shutter opened and closed, and then the photographer left, and their image traveled. It went places they would never go. It was seen by people who would never know their names. It was used to argue for changes they might never benefit from. Here's what we know happened because of photographs like this. Housing reform laws passed. Tenement conditions improved. Not everywhere, not immediately, but over time. Thousands of families eventually lived in better, safer housing. Child mortality rates dropped. Sanitation standards rose. These were real, measurable victories, and images like this one contributed to making them happen. But here's what we don't know. Whether these specific children benefited from those reforms, whether their family was still living in this building when inspections started, whether they moved to better housing or just different bad housing, whether they survived to adulthood, whether they ever saw this photograph in a newspaper or a report, whether they recognized themselves, whether they felt proud that their image helped change things, or whether they felt used. This photograph changed policy without preserving identity. It helped improve conditions for thousands while erasing the specific people who made the case. And that's not a contradiction. That's how the system was designed. Let me be clear about something. I'm not arguing that reform photography was wrong. The housing conditions these photographs documented were real. The suffering was real. The need for change was urgent, and reform photography helped create that change. But I am saying this: there was a cost. The cost was paid by the people in the photographs, people who were seen, extensively, publicly seen, but never known. People who contributed to systemic change without ever being asked if they wanted to. This is the bargain that reform photography made. We will use your image to help people like you, but we will not remember you specifically. We will fight for better conditions, but we will not track whether you get those better conditions. We will preserve your photograph, but we will not preserve your name. And from a certain perspective, that makes sense. If the goal is systemic change, individual identities are less important than patterns. If you're trying to pass legislation that affects hundreds of thousands of people, you can't focus on individual stories. You need aggregate data, representative examples, visual proof of widespread problems. That's how you build political will. That's how you change laws. But from another perspective, the perspective of the people being photographed, it's a different story. Because you're not thinking about aggregate data. You're thinking, a stranger just came into my home. They pointed a camera at my children. They took an image that shows the worst moment of our lives, and then they left. And years later, when you see that photograph in a museum archive or a historical database, if you even see it, there's no name attached, no acknowledgement that these were specific people, just tenement family, circa 1910.
But I want to be very clear about the limits of what I can tell you. I can tell you what's in this photograph. I can tell you how images like this were used. I can tell you what reforms resulted from this kind of documentation. But I cannot tell you who these people were. I don't know their names. I don't know what country they immigrated from. I don't know what language they spoke. I don't know if the children went to school or worked or both. I don't know if the family stayed in this apartment or moved somewhere else. I don't know if their living conditions improved. I don't know if they ever saw this photograph published. I don't know how they felt about being photographed. I don't know if they understood what their image would be used for. I don't know if they would have agreed to it if they'd known. And here's the difficult part. I will probably never know any of those things, because the system that created this photograph wasn't designed to preserve that information. It was designed to extract evidence, not to honor people. This photograph is not unique. There are thousands of images like this in reform archives, thousands of families photographed in tenement apartments, thousands of children's faces used as evidence, and the vast majority of them, no names, no follow-up, no trace. In New York City alone, between 1900 and 1920, reformers photographed hundreds of tenement interiors. The Tenement House Department, the Charity Organization Society, various settlement houses and reform organizations, all of them building visual archives to support their work, and all of them operating under the same logic: document the conditions, not the people. You can go to archives today and find these photographs, beautiful, haunting images, children in doorways, families in overcrowded rooms, women working at kitchen tables, each one carefully preserved, each one digitized and accessible. But try to find out who's in the photographs. Almost impossible. The images remain, the identities don't. You might be wondering why I'm telling you all this. Why does it matter that we don't know these children's names? Why does it matter that reform photography erased individual identities in pursuit of systemic change? Here's why. Because we're still doing this. Not with tenement photography, that specific system is gone, but with the logic behind it. We still use images of suffering to argue for change. We still extract evidence from people's lives without preserving their stories. We still treat individuals as data points in larger arguments. Think about modern photojournalism, images of refugees, homeless populations, communities affected by natural disasters. Those photographs serve a purpose. They raise awareness, they generate donations, sometimes they influence policy. But how often do we follow up with the specific people in those images? How often do we track whether they benefited from the attention their suffering generated? How often do we even record their names? Or think about documentary filmmaking. Cameras go into communities, people share their stories, the film gets made, it wins awards, it raises important issues. But what happens to the people who shared those stories? Do they get to control how they're represented? Do they benefit from the success of the film? Or are they just material? I'm not saying these practices are identical to reform photography. They're not. Ethical standards have changed. Informed consent matters now in ways it didn't then. But the underlying logic is still there. The story matters more than the storyteller. The issue matters more than the individual. The image matters more than the person in it. And sometimes, often, that logic produces real good. Awareness gets raised, laws get changed, help arrives. But the people who made that possible, they don't always get remembered. They don't always get thanked. Sometimes they don't even get named.
So here we are, back where we started. A photograph from the early 20th century. 3 children in a damaged tenement apartment. An adult man in the background. An image that was used to argue for housing reform. An image that probably contributed to real policy changes. An image that helped improve conditions for thousands of families. But these specific children, we don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they benefited from the reforms their image helped create. We don't know if anyone ever told them, your photograph mattered, it changed things. We just know they stood there, in that room, on that day, and someone decided their suffering was useful. The photograph remains, clear, detailed, carefully preserved. You can see every crack in the ceiling, every plank in the walls, every expression on the children's faces. But you cannot see their names. You cannot see their futures. You cannot see whether anyone ever came back to help them specifically. The system that created this photograph worked exactly as designed. It documented conditions, it provided evidence, it supported arguments for change. It achieved its purpose, but it never intended to remember these people, only to use them. And that distinction between being seen and being known, between being useful and being remembered, that's what this photograph reveals. This is the second photograph in this series. Each one shows people who were documented, but not in the way they might have wanted. Each one reveals a system that saw them as evidence, not as individuals worth remembering. These photographs were taken to create change, and sometimes they did. But the people in them, they were left behind in the archive, visible but unnamed, present but not permanent, useful but not remembered. The photographs remain. The people do not.